Lisbon awoke on the morning of the 1st of November, 1755, wrapped in a sense of continuity that had shaped it for generations. The city stretched along the banks of the Tagus, its hills layered with churches, palaces, and tightly packed houses of stone and tile. It was All Saints' Day, among the most significant dates in the Catholic calendar, and the capital moved through familiar rhythms. Bells rang across parishes, calling the faithful to morning mass as daily routines unfolded without urgency. The wealth of Lisbon revealed itself quietly but unmistakably. Gold from Brazil had funded monasteries, grand churches, and public buildings intended to project permanence and divine favor. This was a capital that understood itself as prosperous and protected, a place where imperial authority, religious devotion, and economic power appeared to reinforce one another. Its streets reflected a confidence rooted in tradition, suggesting that order and stability were not temporary conditions, but enduring features of the world. Religion shaped the morning with particular intensity. Thousands gathered inside vast stone churches whose ceilings rose above crowded naves, heavy with decoration and candlelight. Incense drifted through still air as prayers echoed against thick walls built to last centuries. These interiors were considered sanctuaries in every sense, offering spiritual reassurance and physical shelter. Few questioned the safety of such spaces or imagined that devotion and architecture could ever fail simultaneously. Beyond the churches, the city followed its quieter patterns. Merchants prepared stalls, carts moved slowly through narrow streets, and sailors walked toward the harbor under a pale autumn sky. Families dressed carefully for the holy day, opening shutters and tending fires in their hearths. Conversations turned to familiar concerns: work, food, obligation, matters that felt manageable within a world believed to be fundamentally predictable and secure. Lisbon's geography reinforced this sense of permanence. Built across uneven hills beside a broad estuary, the city had adapted confidently to land and water over centuries. Its port connected Portugal to distant continents, making the capital a vital node in global exchange. Ships rested calmly at anchor that morning, their crews unaware that the tranquil surface of the Tagus concealed forces capable of sudden and violent transformation. The city's institutions mirrored this confidence in continuity. Authority flowed through established hierarchies, from monarchy to church, from officials to guilds and households. Governance relied on inherited structures and slow deliberation rather than rapid response. There were no preparations for sudden catastrophe, because such an event lay outside common imagination. Lisbon understood itself as enduring, protected by order, faith, and tradition. Even in poorer quarters, routine provided reassurance. Life there was harder, yet familiar, shaped by knowledge of streets, neighbors, and unwritten rules of survival. People understood how to endure within the existing order, relying on shared expectations rather than contingency. This collective familiarity created a fragile sense of security, one that concealed vulnerabilities beneath the surface of everyday life. The sounds of the morning reinforced the illusion of stability. Footsteps echoed on stone, voices filled markets, and bells continued their steady ringing. The Tagus moved gently beneath a clear sky, untouched by omen or disturbance. As crowds gathered indoors, the streets briefly emptied, concentrating life within massive buildings whose solidity was taken for granted. Nothing suggested urgency or danger. At that moment, Lisbon existed fully within the assumptions of its age. Nature was believed to operate under divine order, and disasters were understood as moral lessons rather than physical processes. The ground itself was considered reliable, a foundation for faith and empire alike. No one sensed the immense pressures building silently beneath the city. Within moments, this certainty would be irrevocably shattered. The first tremor struck without warning, tearing through the stillness of the morning. The ground beneath Lisbon shuddered violently, as if the city itself had been seized and shaken. Stone walls groaned, bells fell silent mid-ring, and the familiar rhythms of the holy day collapsed in an instant. What had seemed solid and dependable moments earlier revealed itself as unstable, driven by forces far beyond human control. Inside churches, the shock turned devotion into confusion. Floors rippled beneath crowded naves as chandeliers swung and masonry cracked overhead. People struggled to remain standing, grasping pillars and pews as the structures meant to shelter them began to fail. Prayers dissolved into cries, and certainty gave way to panic as the physical world intruded violently upon the spiritual space. Across the streets, Buildings fractured under the strain. Facades split open, roofs collapsed inward, and entire walls fell outward into narrow lanes. Clouds of dust rose quickly, obscuring the city in a choking haze. Those caught outside ran blindly, dodging falling stone and timber as the ground heaved again, each movement amplifying fear and disorientation. The tremors did not pass swiftly. They came in waves, each surge prolonging terror and destruction. People who had survived the first shock found no relief, only the growing realization that the event was far from over. Lisbon's geography, once a source of pride, now magnified the violence as hills shifted and streets cracked along hidden fault lines. Within minutes, the city's sense of order disintegrated. Authority offered no guidance, and ritual provided no protection. The structures that had embodied permanence collapsed with alarming ease, undermining deeply held beliefs about stability and divine favor. What remained was movement without direction, survival without understanding, and a collective struggle to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. As buildings fell, fires began to spread. Candles overturned, hearths spilled embers, and debris ignited across the city. Narrow streets trapped heat and smoke, transforming local damage into a wider threat. Survivors fled open spaces, unaware that the catastrophe was evolving into something even more destructive. Along the riverfront, the Earth's violence produced a deceptive calm. The waters of the Tagus withdrew suddenly, exposing the riverbed and drawing crowds toward the shore. Many mistook this retreat as refuge, unaware that it signaled another danger approaching from beyond sight. Confusion replaced caution as people sought safety wherever it appeared to exist. Moments later, the river returned with overwhelming force. A massive wave surged inland, crashing through the lower districts and sweeping away ships, docks, and people alike. The tsunami compounded the earthquake's destruction, erasing entire areas in seconds. What the ground had broken apart, the water carried away without distinction. By the time the shaking subsided, Lisbon was no longer recognizable. The city's physical form, social order, and sense of certainty had been violently dismantled. What remained was silence broken only by fire, water, and human suffering. The disaster had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. The world was neither stable nor predictable, and its forces would reshape Lisbon forever. The violence of the earth had not yet finished its work when fire began to claim what stone had left standing. Across Lisbon, overturned candles and shattered hearths ignited fallen beams and scattered furnishings. Flames crept first through narrow interiors, then burst outward into streets already thick with dust and debris. What had begun as tremor now deepened into a new and relentless phase of destruction. Wind moved unpredictably through the ruined city, feeding the growing infernos. Wooden structures, exposed by collapsed masonry, caught quickly and burned fiercely. Sparks leapt from roof to roof, carried across districts that had once been tightly woven together by commerce and proximity. The very density that had defined Lisbon's vitality now ensured that fire would spread with devastating efficiency. Attempts to contain the flames faltered almost immediately. Wells were blocked by rubble, aqueduct channels were damaged, and organized response proved nearly impossible amid continuing instability. Buckets passed hand to hand offered little resistance against walls of heat. The catastrophe was no longer singular but layered, combining earthquake, tsunami, and fire into a single unfolding calamity. In the lower districts, water and flame collided in chaotic sequence. Areas struck by the tsunami lay soaked and shattered, yet nearby quarters burned unchecked. Smoke rose in thick columns, darkening the sky above the Tagus and casting an unnatural twilight over the city. Survivors navigated between flooded streets and advancing embers, uncertain which threat demanded immediate flight. Night did not bring relief. Instead, darkness amplified fear as flames illuminated collapsed facades in flickering orange light. Entire neighborhoods glowed against the horizon, visible from ships offshore and from hills beyond the city walls. The firestorm consumed archives, homes, warehouses, and places of worship without distinction, erasing not only structures but memory and record. The heat grew so intense that stone itself fractured under strain. Iron bent, timber disintegrated, and air became nearly unbreathable in confined streets. Those who had survived the earthquake now faced suffocation or immolation. Survival required constant movement, yet every path appeared compromised by smoke, debris, or surging crowds. Beyond the city center, tremors continued to unsettle the ground. Aftershocks rippled through already weakened foundations, causing additional collapses that fed the flames. The sense of duration became unbearable. Hours blurred together as destruction unfolded in overlapping waves, leaving no clear boundary between one phase of disaster and the next. From vantage points on higher ground, observers witnessed an altered landscape. Lisbon's skyline, once defined by church towers and civic buildings, dissolved into a horizon of smoke and intermittent fire. The scale of devastation defied comprehension. What had been one of Europe's great capitals now resembled a battlefield shaped not by armies, but by the earth itself. As dawn approached once more, the fires still raged. The city that had awakened in ritual and certainty now existed in fragments, its order irreparably broken. The earthquake had shattered foundations, but it was the fire that transformed destruction into obliteration. Lisbon stood at the threshold of a new and uncertain existence. When the fires began to weaken and the smoke thinned enough to reveal the ground beneath, Lisbon confronted the scale of its loss. Entire quarters had vanished, reduced to ash, rubble, and stagnant pools of water. Streets once crowded with merchants and pilgrims lay silent, interrupted only by the crackle of embers and the cries of the injured. The city's destruction was no longer unfolding, it had become a fact to be reckoned with. The first task was not rebuilding, but counting. Yet even that proved almost impossible. Bodies lay beneath collapsed structures, within churches, along riverbanks, and buried in layers of debris. Many were never recovered. Estimates varied wildly, but thousands had perished within hours, transforming a thriving capital into a vast and improvised field of mourning. Disease quickly threatened to follow devastation. The combination of corpses, contaminated water, and lingering smoke created conditions ripe for epidemic. Authorities recognized the urgency. The removal of the dead became both a humanitarian and strategic necessity. Survival now depended not only on endurance, but on decisive organization. Under the direction of Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquis of Pombal, swift measures were imposed. Rather than allowing paralysis to take hold, he moved to establish order amid chaos. Fires were suppressed where possible, looting was punished, and the dead were transported beyond the city's limits. Burial at sea was authorized to prevent further contamination. The decision was stark and pragmatic. Barges carried bodies out into the Tagus and beyond its mouth into the Atlantic. It was a departure from customary burial rites, yet the scale of loss demanded deviation from tradition. In this moment, necessity overrode ceremony. The preservation of the living required difficult, immediate action. Meanwhile, makeshift camps formed outside the devastated center. Survivors gathered in open fields and along less damaged outskirts, erecting temporary shelters from salvaged materials. Fear of further tremors discouraged return to unstable ruins. The population existed in suspension, uncertain whether the earth beneath them had truly settled. Food supplies were disrupted, and commercial networks shattered. Lisbon had been a maritime hub connecting Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Warehouses storing spices, grain, and precious goods had burned or been swept away. The disaster reverberated far beyond Portugal, interrupting trade routes and financial systems dependent upon the city's port. News traveled quickly across Europe. Reports described a capital leveled in minutes, followed by fire and tidal wave. In an age deeply shaped by religious interpretation, the catastrophe provoked intense debate. Was this divine judgment, natural phenomenon, or some combination of both? Lisbon's tragedy would soon extend into philosophical and scientific discourse. Amid grief and uncertainty, a critical question emerged. Would Lisbon rebuild as it had been, or would destruction open the possibility of transformation? The city stood at a crossroads between restoration and reinvention. From the ruins of catastrophe, a new vision of governance, architecture, and urban planning began quietly to take form. Lisbon did not have the luxury of prolonged despair. Amid smoke and mourning, a new question imposed itself with urgency. How should a city rebuild after such devastation? The destruction had been nearly total in its core, leaving space not only for reconstruction, but for redefinition. What would rise from the ruins would not simply replace what was lost, it would reflect a new philosophy of order, resilience, and authority. The Marquis of Pombal moved swiftly to centralize decision-making. Rather than allowing fragmented interests to dictate recovery, he imposed a coordinated vision. Surveyors were dispatched to measure damage and map the altered terrain. Engineers and architects were summoned to design a capital that would no longer depend solely on tradition, but on calculation and structural foresight. The medieval labyrinth of narrow streets was deemed inadequate. In its place, plans emerged for wide, rectilinear avenues capable of facilitating movement and reducing fire risk. The new layout would prioritize visibility and accessibility, imposing geometric clarity upon what had once grown organically over centuries. Lisbon's reconstruction became an exercise in Enlightenment rationality applied to urban space. Innovations extended beyond street alignment. Engineers developed what became known as the Pombaline cage, a wooden framework embedded within masonry walls to absorb seismic shock. Scaled models were reportedly tested by marching troops around them, simulating tremors. The goal was not aesthetic novelty, but structural survival in a city newly aware of geological instability. Uniform facades replaced irregular profiles. Buildings along principal avenues were designed with standardized heights and proportions, creating visual cohesion. Beneath this uniformity lay calculated reinforcement. The rebuilt Lisbon would communicate stability through symmetry, even as it concealed newly integrated mechanisms of resilience within its walls. The Praça do Comércio, constructed along the Tagus waterfront, symbolized both continuity and transformation. It reopened the city to maritime commerce while presenting a disciplined architectural statement. Where chaos had once reigned, order now stood in deliberate formation. The square became a visible declaration that Lisbon would not retreat from its global connections. Reconstruction also carried political implications. Central authority expanded under the guise of necessity. Regulations governed materials, construction methods, and even property boundaries. While framed as practical safeguards, these measures strengthened the state's influence over urban life. Disaster thus became catalyst not only for architectural reform, but for administrative consolidation. The rebuilding of Lisbon attracted attention across Europe. Foreign observers studied its methods, recognizing in the city a model for modern urban planning. What had begun as catastrophe evolved into experiment. Lisbon emerged as one of the first capitals consciously redesigned according to principles of seismic engineering and rational organization. Yet memory of loss persisted beneath the new geometry. The rebuilt streets covered sites of profound trauma, even as daily life resumed. Lisbon's transformation demonstrated resilience, but it also marked a turning point in how societies understood disaster. The earthquake had shattered stone, the reconstruction reshaped thought itself. The earthquake did not end at the borders of Portugal. Its tremors were felt as far away as Spain, Morocco, and parts of southern France. In some coastal regions, the sea withdrew and returned with unsettling force, echoing Lisbon's devastation in lesser but still alarming degrees. What had struck the Portuguese capital was immediately understood as an event of continental magnitude. Within weeks, letters describing the catastrophe circulated through diplomatic channels and private correspondence alike. Merchants, clergy, and ambassadors recounted scenes of collapse, fire, and tidal destruction. These testimonies traveled faster than ships could cross the Atlantic, carried by the urgency of disbelief. Lisbon had become not merely a ruined city, but a shared European shock. Religious authorities interpreted the event through familiar theological frameworks. Sermons proclaimed divine judgment, moral correction, or inscrutable providence. The timing, All Saints' Day, deepened symbolic resonance. Churches filled across Europe with congregations seeking reassurance or repentance, even as questions lingered beneath ritual certainty. Yet the earthquake also unsettled established doctrine. Philosophers and natural thinkers began to ask whether such destruction could be explained without invoking divine punishment. Voltaire would later reflect on Lisbon in poetry and prose, challenging optimistic philosophies that portrayed the world as inherently ordered and benevolent. The disaster forced Enlightenment Europe to confront the problem of suffering in stark terms. Scientific inquiry accelerated in response. Scholars collected eyewitness accounts, comparing descriptions of ground motion and tidal behavior. Early attempts were made to map the reach of the tremors and classify their intensity. Though geology remained an emerging discipline, Lisbon provided one of the first opportunities to examine a natural disaster through systematic observation rather than purely theological interpretation. In Britain, France, and the German states, debates unfolded in salons and academies. Could earthquakes be natural phenomena governed by physical laws? If so, what mechanisms lay beneath the Earth's crust? The Lisbon catastrophe helped stimulate inquiry into subterranean forces, encouraging a gradual shift toward empirical analysis of natural events. Economic repercussions also extended outward. Insurance markets fluctuated, trade contracts were disrupted, and confidence in maritime hubs wavered. Investors across Europe recalculated risk in light of Lisbon's collapse. The event revealed how interconnected 18th-century economies had already become, with disaster in one capital resonating across financial networks. Political observers drew their own conclusions. Some viewed Portugal's rapid administrative response as a model of decisive governance. Others questioned the expansion of central authority justified by emergency. Lisbon became case study and cautionary tale simultaneously, illustrating both the vulnerability of urban centers and the power of coordinated state action. By the end of 1756, the earthquake had entered European consciousness not only as tragedy, but as turning point. It reshaped theological debate, stimulated scientific curiosity, and influenced economic thought. The ground had shifted physically beneath Lisbon, but intellectually it had shifted beneath Europe itself. In the years after 1755, Lisbon's earthquake became more than a memory of ruin. It became a problem to be explained. Across Europe, scholars began to treat the event as evidence that nature operated through forces that could be studied, recorded, and perhaps anticipated. The catastrophe had stripped away complacency, leaving behind a new appetite for causes rather than consolation. In Portugal, the Marquis of Pombal ordered an unprecedented investigation. A detailed questionnaire was distributed to parishes across the kingdom, asking witnesses to describe the tremors, the direction of movement, the duration of shaking, and the behavior of wells and rivers. The aim was systematic collection of data, not moral interpretation. In effect, Portugal conducted one of the earliest large-scale seismic surveys in history. Responses revealed patterns that could not be ignored. Some areas had felt sharp jolts, others long rolling waves. Coastal regions reported unusual changes in sea level and violent surges. Inland communities spoke of cracks opening in the ground and aftershocks continuing for weeks. These accounts, gathered in aggregate, suggested that the earthquake was not a local accident, but part of a broader geological mechanism. Natural philosophers proposed competing theories. Some imagined subterranean fires, others vast underground caverns collapsing, releasing shock through the Earth's crust. A few suggested electrical forces or atmospheric disturbances, blending emerging scientific language with older speculation. Though modern tectonics lay far in the future, Lisbon forced thinkers to confront the possibility that the Earth itself was dynamic and restless. The disaster also encouraged new attention to building science. Engineers debated which materials flexed and which failed. Timber frames, it seemed, could absorb motion better than rigid stone. In Lisbon, reconstruction embodied these lessons, but elsewhere the earthquake prompted renewed scrutiny of urban vulnerability. Cities began to be imagined not only as cultural centers, but as physical systems subject to natural stress. At sea, ship captains offered another layer of evidence. Some reported strange waves far from the Portuguese coast on the day of the quake, as though a disturbance had propagated across the Atlantic. Such testimonies hinted that the event was not confined to Lisbon streets, but had displaced immense volumes of water. The earthquake was becoming a global phenomenon in the minds of those who studied it. Over time, the Lisbon catastrophe helped shape the emerging concept of a natural disaster as a category distinct from divine punishment. The distinction did not erase religious belief, but it created space for parallel explanation. Earthquakes could now be spoken of in terms of magnitude, duration, and effects, measurable qualities rather than purely symbolic ones. This shift carried an unsettling implication. If disasters were governed by natural laws, then they were not necessarily moral events. Innocence offered no protection, and virtue guaranteed nothing. The world could be indifferent. For 18th-century Europe, that idea was both liberating and profoundly disturbing, challenging assumptions that had long underpinned theology and politics. Lisbon's ruins had produced not only new streets, but a new scientific temperament. Observation, classification, and cautious hypothesis became tools for understanding what had once been described only through providence. In searching for the earthquake's causes, Europe was also redefining how it understood the Earth itself and humanity's place upon it. In the wake of Lisbon's destruction, the question that echoed across Europe was not only how the Earth had moved, but why. For many, the catastrophe revived ancient anxieties about divine justice. If God governed the world with providential care, how could churches collapse upon worshippers gathered in devotion? The earthquake did not merely fracture stone, it unsettled confidence in moral order. Clergy across Catholic and Protestant lands sought to frame the event within established doctrine. Some preached that Lisbon's suffering reflected collective sin, a warning intended to correct spiritual complacency. Others emphasized the inscrutability of divine will, arguing that human understanding could not grasp the totality of God's design. In sermons and pamphlets, reassurance competed with unease. Yet the scale and randomness of the destruction proved difficult to reconcile with simple moral explanations. Entire families perished regardless of virtue or vice. Sacred spaces were destroyed alongside taverns and marketplaces. The apparent impartiality of the disaster challenged narratives that tied catastrophe neatly to punishment. Doubt did not replace belief, but it introduced tension into long-held certainties. Philosophers seized upon this tension. Voltaire's reflections on Lisbon became emblematic of a broader critique of optimistic theology. He questioned the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds, exposing the fragility of philosophical systems confronted by mass suffering. Through satire and verse, he articulated a discomfort that many felt but struggled to express. Others responded differently. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that human choices had amplified natural harm. Dense urban construction, he suggested, had turned tremor into tragedy. The earthquake thus entered debates not only about divine justice, but about social organization and responsibility. Blame could be assigned to human decisions as readily as to heavenly decree. The disaster also influenced emerging discussions of tolerance and pluralism. If catastrophe could strike without moral discrimination, then suffering might be recognized as a universal human condition rather than a mark of spiritual failure. This realization, tentative and incomplete, subtly reshaped ethical thought across the Enlightenment world. Pamphlets, poems, and treatises circulated widely, carrying arguments from Lisbon to London, from Paris to Berlin. The earthquake became intellectual currency, invoked in disputes about providence, free will, and natural law. Rarely had a single event generated such sustained philosophical engagement within so short a time. For many ordinary people, however, the response was more intimate. Private letters reveal fear, resignation, and renewed devotion intermingled. Some intensified religious practice, others expressed quiet skepticism. The earthquake's aftershocks thus extended beyond geology into the interior lives of individuals navigating uncertainty. In confronting Lisbon, Europe was forced to acknowledge the limits of explanation. Neither theology nor science alone could dissolve the anguish produced by sudden loss. The catastrophe remained a wound in memory, even as it stimulated debate. Faith endured, but it did so within a landscape altered by doubt, where certainty no longer stood entirely unchallenged. In the decades that followed 1755, Lisbon's earthquake did not fade into obscurity. It settled into Europe's collective memory as a benchmark of catastrophe. Whenever the earth trembled elsewhere, comparisons were drawn to Lisbon. The name of the city became shorthand for devastation on a scale few had previously imagined, a reference point against which future disasters would be measured. Artists and engravers translated memory into image. Prints circulated depicting collapsing churches, fractured streets, and surging waves overwhelming the waterfront. Though many had never seen the city, Europeans formed mental pictures shaped by these dramatic representations. Visual culture fixed the disaster into imagination, ensuring that Lisbon existed not only as historical event, but as enduring symbol. Literature preserved the emotional register of the catastrophe. Diaries and memoirs described terror beneath falling stone and suffocation beneath smoke-filled skies. Survivors wrote of the sound before the shock, a deep rumble that seemed to rise from beneath the soul as much as from beneath the earth. Such recollections carried fear forward across generations. The earthquake also altered how societies prepared for risk. Municipal authorities in other cities quietly reviewed building standards and emergency responses. Coastal settlements reconsidered the vulnerability of harbors and waterfront districts. Though formal disaster planning remained rudimentary, Lisbon had demonstrated that complacency was dangerous. Awareness itself became a subtle form of preparedness. Religious practice evolved as well. Annual commemorations in Portugal marked the anniversary of the disaster, blending mourning with gratitude for survival. Across Europe, sermons referenced Lisbon as cautionary tale or moral meditation. Memory thus entered ritual, embedding catastrophe within the rhythms of worship and civic remembrance. In intellectual circles, the earthquake remained a touchstone. Philosophers invoked it when debating optimism, providence, and natural law. Scientists cited it when discussing seismic phenomena. Economists referenced it as example of systemic vulnerability. Lisbon functioned as common ground across disciplines, a single event capable of illuminating multiple lines of inquiry. Fear of recurrence lingered in subtler ways. Reports of minor tremors could trigger disproportionate alarm. Rumors spread quickly in port cities whenever the sea behaved unpredictably. Even without visible destruction, the psychological aftershock endured. Lisbon had revealed that stability could be illusion, and that beneath apparent calm lay forces beyond immediate control. Yet over time, resilience asserted itself. The rebuilt city thrived, its rectilinear avenues and reinforced structures standing as quiet rebuttal to despair. Commerce resumed, intellectual life continued, and daily routines reclaimed space once defined by ruin. Memory did not paralyze Lisbon, it coexisted with renewal. By the close of the 18th century, the Great Lisbon Earthquake had become more than a disaster. It was a lesson, a warning, and a catalyst woven into Europe's cultural fabric. Through image, ritual, scholarship, and policy, the event endured. The ground had stilled, but its meaning continued to move through history. By the late 18th century, Lisbon was no longer defined solely by the trauma of 1755. The city had become an example, studied, debated, and cited across Europe as a turning point in the management of catastrophe. What began as devastation evolved into precedent. In rebuilding itself, Lisbon had unknowingly participated in the birth of modern disaster governance. The Pombaline reforms did more than reshape architecture. They demonstrated that a central authority could coordinate large-scale recovery with efficiency and clarity of purpose. Streets were measured, plots reorganized, and construction regulated according to unified standards. The reconstruction offered a template. Disaster need not dissolve order, it could justify and accelerate reform. Urban planning emerged as a discipline more conscious of risk. The grid layout of central Lisbon reflected Enlightenment ideals of rational space, but it also represented a response to fire and collapse. Wide avenues reduced congestion and facilitated evacuation. Uniform facades concealed internal reinforcement. Aesthetic harmony and structural pragmatism merged in ways that would influence future European capitals. Insurance practices evolved in parallel. The scale of financial loss exposed weaknesses in existing risk models. Merchants and insurers reconsidered premiums and coverage, incorporating awareness of seismic threat. Though actuarial science remained primitive, Lisbon's earthquake contributed to a broader realization that uncertainty could be quantified and distributed rather than merely endured. Scientific communities also began to formalize the study of earthquakes. While precise measurement tools were still decades away, correspondences between scholars created early networks of seismic observation. Reports were archived, compared, and preserved for future reference. Lisbon became a foundational case study, cited whenever new tremors shook the continent. The cultural response to disaster likewise shifted. Instead of viewing catastrophe solely as rupture, societies increasingly framed it as opportunity for adaptation. Reconstruction was not only physical but conceptual. The language of resilience, though not yet named as such, entered political and philosophical vocabulary. Lisbon demonstrated that recovery could redefine identity rather than erase it. Portugal itself experienced transformation. The authority of the crown expanded, and administrative mechanisms strengthened under Pombal's leadership. Though controversial, these reforms consolidated power in ways that would shape the nation's trajectory for decades. Disaster had acted as accelerant, compressing years of change into a single moment of upheaval. At the same time, critics remained wary. Some feared that emergency powers might outlast necessity, embedding control where once there had been local autonomy. Lisbon's example thus provoked debate about the balance between security and liberty. Catastrophe revealed not only structural weaknesses in stone, but vulnerabilities in governance. As the century drew toward its close, the Great Lisbon Earthquake stood as more than memory. It had influenced architecture, finance, science, philosophy, and statecraft. The ground that shook in 1755 had reverberated through institutions and ideas. Lisbon had endured destruction, but from that destruction emerged a new way of thinking about risk, responsibility, and the future.
Com este novo plano, Lisboa renascerá mais forte do que antes.
Sim, mas e as viúvas? Devemos garantir que não fiquem desamparadas.
Elas receberão apoio. O legado disto será uma cidade para todos.
Legado duradouro.
As Europe moved toward the close of the 18th century, the Lisbon earthquake remained present in intellectual memory. Though decades had passed, the event continued to echo through debates about reason, authority, and the fragility of institutions. In an age increasingly defined by revolution, Lisbon served as early a reminder that upheaval could erupt without warning, whether from political unrest or from the earth itself. The generation that experienced 1755 firsthand began to pass away, but their testimonies endured in print. Younger thinkers encountered the catastrophe not as lived trauma but as documented history. This transition altered its meaning. What had once been immediate terror gradually became case study, an episode analyzed with distance, yet still charged with symbolic weight. The Enlightenment's faith in rational progress faced repeated tests in these decades. The American Revolution challenged imperial authority. The French Revolution unsettled monarchies across the continent. Against this backdrop of political transformation, Lisbon's destruction acquired renewed relevance. It stood as earlier demonstration that established orders, however imposing, could collapse within moments. Philosophers revisited questions first sharpened by the earthquake. Could societies design systems resilient enough to withstand sudden shocks? Was human reason capable of anticipating every contingency? Lisbon suggested limits. Even the most sophisticated capital of its day had proved vulnerable. The event cautioned against excessive confidence in permanence. Architects and engineers studied structural lessons beyond Portugal's borders. Urban reconstruction projects in other cities incorporated ideas influenced, directly or indirectly, by Pombaline practice. The notion that buildings should anticipate stress rather than merely display grandeur began to circulate more widely. Catastrophe had introduced structural humility into architectural ambition. The moral dimension of disaster also remained contested. Some continued to interpret 1755 through theological frameworks, while others insisted upon naturalistic explanations grounded in emerging science. This coexistence of perspectives reflected broader tensions within European thought. Lisbon had not resolved the debate between providence and mechanism, it had intensified it. Meanwhile, ordinary people carried quieter memories. Families told stories of ancestors who survived the shaking and the sea. Parish records preserved names of the dead. Commemorative masses continued each November. Memory persisted not only in books and treatises, but in domestic and communal rituals that bound generations together. By the 1790s, Europe was entering an era of unprecedented turbulence. Thrones trembled, empires reconfigured, and political ideologies clashed with force. The metaphor of seismic shock became common in describing revolutionary change. Language itself bore the imprint of 1755. The earthquake had expanded vocabulary available to articulate instability. Thus, on the eve of the 19th century, the Great Lisbon Earthquake remained embedded in Europe's consciousness. It was no longer recent, yet it had not faded. The ground had steadied long before, but the intellectual tremors continued. Lisbon had taught that both nature and history possess capacity for sudden rupture, and that societies must learn to rebuild again and again. More than half a century after the earth convulsed beneath Lisbon, the city stood as living testimony to rupture and renewal. The scars of 1755 had not vanished, yet they no longer defined the entirety of its identity. Stone had been replaced, streets reordered, institutions restructured. What endured most powerfully was not the collapse itself, but the capacity to respond. The Great Lisbon Earthquake forced Europe to confront an uncomfortable truth: civilization rests upon foundations that are neither immutable nor invulnerable. Cathedrals, palaces, and libraries, symbols of permanence, had crumbled in minutes. In their fall lay revelation. Human achievement, however refined, exists within forces that exceed human control. Yet the catastrophe also revealed another constant. In the aftermath of terror, people organized, rebuilt, and reimagined their world. Administrators drafted decrees. Architects redesigned districts. Clergy consoled congregations. Merchants recalculated losses and resumed trade. The instinct to reconstruct proved as persistent as the forces that destroyed. Philosophically, 1755 marked a subtle turning point. It did not extinguish faith, nor did it enthrone pure skepticism. Instead, it complicated certainty. Enlightenment optimism persisted, but tempered by awareness of fragility. Theological conviction endured, but confronted by natural explanation. Lisbon did not provide final answers, it insisted upon deeper questions. Architecturally, the rebuilt city embodied this synthesis. Its rational grid and reinforced structures reflected belief in human ingenuity, yet their very design acknowledged risk. Beauty and caution coexisted in stone. The rebuilt Lisbon was neither naive monument to progress nor monument to despair. It was expression of measured resilience. Culturally, the earthquake entered Europe's vocabulary of shock. Writers invoked it as metaphor for sudden upheaval. Politicians described revolutions as tremors shaking established orders. Even centuries later, the phrase "like Lisbon" would surface whenever scale of destruction defied expectation. Memory had transcended geography. Scientifically, the event encouraged systematic observation of natural phenomena. Though modern seismology lay far in the future, 1755 prompted early efforts to catalogue and compare reports. Patterns began to matter. Testimony became data. From scattered accounts emerged first steps toward understanding forces beneath the crust. Politically, the disaster demonstrated that crisis could accelerate reform. Centralized authority in Portugal expanded, urban governance evolved, and administrative coordination intensified. Debate about limits of power followed closely behind. The earthquake thus shaped not only architecture of buildings, but architecture of the state. Today, the streets of Lisbon carry little visible trace of the terror that once unfolded upon them. Visitors walk across Praça do Comércio and along Beixa's ordered avenues without sensing the violence that preceded their symmetry. Yet beneath the paving stones lies history of rupture. The city's calm conceals memory of movement. The Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 remains reminder that stability is provisional. Nature and history share capacity for sudden transformation. What defines societies is not absence of shock, but manner of response. Lisbon endured collapse, and through reconstruction, it altered trajectory of European thought. In that sense, the day the world shook did not end when the tremors ceased. It continues in every debate about risk, resilience, and responsibility. The earth stilled, the sea withdrew, the fires burned out. But the questions raised in 1755 still move quietly beneath the surface of modern life.